Hi YouTubers, this is Bodge in the Woods, back for another episode of Gear Review. Actually, this is really my first episode of Gear Review since I did my review of the Big Agnes Copper Spur UL2 before my JMT trip last summer. This is more of a comparison video. I've always been really interested in the comparison between hammock setups and tent setups. In fact, I had converted almost exclusively to hammock setup for years because as I got older, it was just more comfortable for me to spend time in hammocks. My body just more easily got in and out of hammocks as opposed to coming off the ground in tents. And I thought I had basically gotten to that point of no return where I was going to camp in hammocks for the rest of my life. And then my son and I started planning our JMT trip, and we realized a good portion of the JMT is above tree line, and consequently there's no opportunity to hang hammocks in that area. Now, after having hiked about 117 miles of the JMT, I can tell you there were some stretches where we could definitely have hammock camped, but there were also some stretches where you just didn't have that luxury. So we did take a tent, so I converted or maybe reverted to tent camping again last year at the beginning of 2016. So I still have my hammock set up, but I also have my tent set up, and I have the ability now to give what I think is a pretty informed opinion on the difference between hammock and tent camping and why I like one or the other and what the advantages might be one way or the other, especially for those that may just be getting into backpacking and are considering tent camping or they're considering hammock camping. So I want to just basically give a little caveat. This is simply my opinion. This is not an informed opinion necessarily. It's my experience, and my experience, of course, will be unique to the conditions that I hike and camp in, and will also, of course, yours will be unique and different to yours. I can say that it's based upon probably 12 to 15 days in both of these setups, so I've got a good, a good background there and some information that I think will enable me to give a pretty informed opinion on why, again, I like both, and how I think that both of these setups in some way, shape, or form might be applicable to your hiking and backpacking style. So, without further ado, let me give you just a little bit of background information. I'm going to turn the camera around here and I'm going to show you exactly what gear we're talking about. Here we go. The equipment that I have is based upon a lot of research that I did before I began true backpack camping with hammocks, and also the research that I did for about 6 months before I started my JMT hike. This is some pretty nice gear. It's not inexpensive gear. It's pretty much ultralight gear, though I'm not an ultralight backpacker. This is pretty much an ultralight setup as far as sleep system and shelters go. But again, these are my specific preferences based upon my months of research, and I can say that both of these work really well for me. I don't have a preference as far as other tents, other hammocks, those kinds of things. I really haven't spent a lot of time with other products myself. I did have some inexpensive hammocks before I bought the War Bonnet, and I did have a couple of cheaper Kelty tents, but this is kind of based upon my limited experience with these two setups. On the left is what I'm calling my hammock setup, and on the right is my tent setup. And I'll just briefly tell you from the top on the left. And I did want to mention that the bag that I'm going to be talking about here, my bag is actually a Hammock Gear Burrow 0 degree quilt. I actually bought that for the JMT. I was really concerned about temps getting below the 20s, and my prior bag was a 20 degree bag. I would use this quilt for my tent camping as well as my hammock camping. I'm sticking it on the left side with my hammock camping setup just so I can show you basically how much space it's going to take up. But remember, that quilt is going to go with me whether I'm tent camping or I'm backpack camping. So, top left, that is my Hammock Gear 0 degree Burrow quilt. I'm going to go ahead and give you the specs on these things as we're going through, and then we'll talk specifically about totals and everything. The weight on that quilt, and I just bought this about 6 months ago, so it should be consistent with what you're going to pay now. But anyway, the weight on that quilt is 24.9 ounces. Again, that's a 0 degree wide, regular length quilt. I really don't have much more to say about it. Most of you probably know the Hammock Gear equipment. Very, very well made, incredibly well stitched. The Hammock Gear's customer support is just outstanding. I like their products, and you'll see a lot of my gear is from Hammock Gear. Coming on down on the left, that's my Hammock Gear Cuban fiber tarp. That Cuban fiber tarp weighs 9.7 ounces. Below that is my Warbonnet Blackbird hammock, weighs 28.5 ounces. And then on the very bottom is my most recent purchase. Can't wait to get this thing out. That is the Warbonnet Warbonnet Wookie, sorry about that, underquilt, which weighs 19.7 ounces. So the weight on my hammock setup is a total of 82.8 ounces or 5.18 pounds. Now on the right side, at the very top of the stack, I've just got my 30 degree sleeping bag up there. Again, I would move that quilt over and actually make it part of my setup. So remember, the quilt weighs 24.9 ounces. Below that is my Big Agnes Copper Spur UL2 tent. That tent plus the poles and stakes weighs 45 ounces total. 45 ounces total. Again, that's for the stakes and for the fly and for the tent itself and the poles. Below that is my Thermarest Neo Air X Therm sleeping pad. Most of you that have compared sleeping pads know that that's one of the warmest sleeping pads that you can buy for the weight. It's 5.5 R, I think, on the insulation factor. Incredibly comfortable pad. It is a little noisy, and it can be sometimes less than durable. But if you take good care of it and you use a ground sheet, not really any problems with it. I've had it on the trail now for about 15 days, had no issues with it puncturing or anything like that. Of course, I do take with me a patch kit just in case. But anyway, that pad weighs 14.3 ounces. And then finally, right below that, that is just my Tyvek ground sheet. That weighs 6.8 ounces. The total on these setups, on that setup is 91.5 ounces, or a total of 5.72 pounds. That's a difference of 5.72 minus 5.18, or basically 0.54 pounds between those two setups. So in this case, the hammock is actually a little bit lighter than the tent setup. Now, a lot of you are going to tell me, hey, I've got a Z-Pax Hexamid or a Z-Pax Duplex, which you can probably stick in there for 19 ounces. Those are trekking poles, or the Lunar Eclipse by the Solo Lunar Eclipse. There are a lot of lighter tents than this. I went with the Big Agnes Copper Spur primarily because it's a freestanding tent. I didn't want to have to worry about trying to get stakes in the ground in the Sierras, so really wanted not only did I want the utility of being able to have a setup without stakes, but I also love the fact that I could leave the rain fly off this thing, and we could basically cowboy camp and see the stars. And if you've ever camped in the Sierras, you know how beautiful the stars and the Milky Way are up there. So that's one of the reasons I really liked it. But anyway, that's why I went with that tent, that setup. So as I said, the hammock wins the weight battle, 5.18 pounds compared to 5.72 pounds for the tent setup. Now let's talk a little bit about price. Another very practical consideration, especially if you're new to backpacking. If you're really new to backpacking and you're trying to decide whether or not you want to get into it, maybe you're going to be discouraged by some of these prices. I'm not advocating going out and spending this much money just to see if you like backpacking or not, but I've been backpacking for years so that I knew I was going to continue, and I wanted the best gear I could get for the money, so I was willing to spend a decent amount for it. But anyway, let me go through the price on my hammock setup. The hammock itself, that Warbonnet Blackbird, currently still retails on their website for $170. Now, I got the 1.7 ripstop single layer hammock. You could go with a double layer. It's a little bit heavier and a little more expensive, but I went with a single layer 1.7. Then the tarp, that Cuban fiber tarp, as most of you know, Cuban fiber is not inexpensive, was $295. It's a tarp with doors. So I really have a nice 3-season setup with this one. The top quilt, that Hammock Gear top quilt, as I said, would also be the quilt for my tent setup. Is $249, and the underquilt itself is $250. So the total price on the hammock setup is $964. Going down the tent setup, as I mentioned earlier, the bag, of course, I just move across. The bag, as we said, was $249. Currently, the Big Agnes Copper Spur UL2 is retailing for about $340. You can find it for a little bit more than that or a little bit less, but that's probably a good average price. So $340. The pad is $157. That's currently the price, though I paid more for it about 6 months ago. And you can figure that Tyvek ground sheet's about $10. So the total is $756 on the tent setup. So that's a difference of $964 minus $756, or $208 difference in the two setups. So the tent setup is a good bit less expensive. That's almost a fourth less expensive than the hammock setup. Again, hammock setup, you just have more expensive components. I don't know what else to say. That's why it's a little more expensive. Let me talk a little bit about some of the miscellaneous. Before I get that, let me talk about pack space. Now, when I first started hammock camping, I thought that my hammock was going to take up tons of room in my pack, and it was just going to be almost unjustifiably large. But the interesting thing about the hammock setup compared to the tent setup is it actually takes up a little less pack space. The total pack space, and you'll note I've got these kind of side by side, and you can tell on the left side the hammock is just a little bit more narrow. So the total on the tent setup is 449.8 cubic inches. The total on the hammock setup is 384 cubic inches. So there's a difference there of about 65 cubic inches. The hammock it does take up less pack space, and I do want to say, I know that you see all these things in stuff sacks. I am not really a proponent of stuff sacks for the most part. I typically tend to take most of my gear out and stuff it, especially my quilts and anything that's packable. I'll stuff into a waterproof sack that I'll keep inside my pack. So this is kind of maybe misleading, because the way that I'll pack this in my backpack doesn't necessarily indicate the way that it's going to wind up in there. But this gives you a good idea, maybe a good visual depiction of the difference between the hammock setup and the tent setup as relates to pack space. Now, let me talk again a little bit more about miscellaneous. The reason I converted to hammock hanging for 2 or 3 years I was contemplating, but the real reason I converted was because it had just become so uncomfortable for me to sleep on the ground that I could not get a good night's sleep in a tent. So I had actually, like most of you, had begun watching a lot of videos by Shug Emery, who is really the little G god of hammock camping, and Shug just made it seem almost like a nirvana to be able to sleep in a hammock in the woods, and made it seem very attractive to me. So I started, slowly but surely working my way from tents into hammocks. And now that I have this full hammock setup, which gives me, again, true 3 seasons, in fact, I've been out in 4 seasons with this setup capability, I'm absolutely in love with the comfort of the hammock. So I've got to say that from a miscellaneous factor, the hammock is definitely more comfortable to me. I just prefer it. I like being suspended. I like having the ability to kind of just really feel like I'm nestled by my underquilt and by my top quilt, and I don't know, it's just for me. And it also gives me the ability to set up in the hammock, and I basically have a ready-made seat, so I don't have to worry about sitting on the ground. It's easy to get my shoes on and off, my socks on and off. So I'm a big firm proponent of the comfort of the hammock. The other thing about the hammock is ease of setup. If you have 2 trees basically 12 to 15 feet apart, you've got a place to put a hammock, and that includes uneven terrain, streams, down logs, stones. Those kinds of things are not really a concern in your hammock, because you're not going to be on the ground and you don't have to worry about those. Because you have the ability with the hammock to set the tarp up in porch mode, I think it gives you a somewhat better view sometimes. You're not completely encased in a tent and restricted by the views that the tent sometimes brings. What I think are some benefits of the tent. I think the tent does tend to be a little more weatherproof. As far as keeping your gear inside. Now, the Copper Spur 2, of course, is a 2-man tent. When I did the JMT with my son, we both slept in it. But if I'm doing solo hikes, I'll take it with me and I'll keep all my gear inside the tent. So I had been out in monsoons in that Copper Spur and didn't worry not even the slightest bit about my gear getting wet, about the tent itself getting wet, or of course me or my quilt or anything else getting wet. It's pretty much bomb-proof once you get inside it. Now, you can do the same thing with your hammock. In fact, I didn't include in my hammock setup my 2Q ZQ underquilt protector, which I take on me on almost all trips, especially if I think there's going to be rain, because it does protect the underquilt from splash up and that sort of thing. But you do have a tendency for rain to want to blow in sometimes, or maybe to blow up under your tarp or quilt. Now you can cinch it down as best you can, but when you do that, it really restricts your living space. And I think from a weatherproof standpoint, the tent's just a little bit better weatherproof, and that's just my experience with it. I will say this: it's easier to eat under the tent if you've got rain, because eat under the hammock, because you've got the tarp that you can set up in porch mode and gives you plenty of room to actually dine under there. But from a true weatherproofness, I think the tent wins hands down on that. Another thing about the tent, this is a biggie for a lot of people, and why a lot of people are discouraged by hammock camping, is the fiddle factor. That Big Agnes copper spur, and I'll show you, I'm going to do a setup demonstration in just a little while. That Big Agnes copper spur UL2 is so easy to set up and take down. It's just a no-brainer. There's no fiddling with it. Once you get it up, you throw your pad in, you throw your quilt in, and you're good to go. Hammocks do have that little bit of fiddle factor. Now, I have not used my brand new Wookiee underquilt yet. The reason I bought this, I had another hammock gear. In fact, I still have another hammock gear underquilt. But all those involve some fiddling, moving the quilt back and forth to get those the kind of fit that you need to avoid those cold spots or hot spots in your hammock. This Wookiee underquilt gives me the ability just to basically hang it there, and as opposed to conform itself perfectly to my my Warbonnet Blackbird hammock. So looking forward to getting that one installed to see how well it does. But again, there is some fiddling. There's fiddling with the tarp, there's fiddling with the top quilt and with the bug net and everything. So there's no fiddle factor with the tent. Another thing I like about that. From a true stargazing standpoint, yeah, you can leave your tarp off, but I really liked in the Sierras having the rain fly off, and I would kind of just clip it back, and if I needed to deploy it, at night because rains might move in, it was easy to do that. So I think it's just a little easier to keep a true stargazing option available to you in the tent. Of course, the disadvantage to the tent, and this is why a lot of us get away from tents, is you have to find the perfect spot, basically. And it's tough to do sometimes. It's tough to find flat spots. It's tough to find spots that don't have a lot of rocks or a lot of roots, or, it's just more difficult to find perfect tent sites than it is perfect hammock sites. But there are advantages and disadvantages, and some of you probably can think of other advantages and disadvantages, but those are the things that I've considered most when I've considered whether I wanted to go with hammocks or whether I wanted to go with tents. Now, let me turn this thing off. I'm going to get all these things outside, and I'm going to give you a real-time view of exactly what it takes to get these things set up and how much time. And then we'll talk, at the end of this, we'll talk a little bit more about why I choose one over the other and why it's my recommendation. Be back soon. Thanks. Let me go ahead and get my trusty stopwatch started here, though. And this is going to be from start to finish, and I'll try to do this in real time, but if it gets too long, I'll have to edit it. So here we go. I don't usually use stakes on this tent unless it is breezy. On the JMT, the entire time we were on the trail, I used stakes 1-9. But simulate what conditions you might encounter. The great thing about the copper spur, I showed you this in my review, is it's all color coordinated. So if you see, these are actually gray. Well, easier to get it on there and show you. Now I'll show you what I was talking about earlier. You can see tape is silver there, and you attach it to the silver one over here. And as you can see, these are orange. Orange on orange. Now, just for illustration's sake, I'm not going to tie out some everything on the end, but I could. I have plenty of stakes for that. And that is 6 minutes and 50 seconds basically from start to finish. Now, the other thing I've got to do this is part of the setup, and it's a part that most backpackers detest. And I've got a solution to this, and I'll probably show you a video on this later on. It's pumping up your pad. Most people, of course, blow it up. Problem is, you know, when you're blowing it up, it's cold. You worry about condensation getting in there and maybe freezing. But 72 degrees in February today. I'm not too worried about it. Okay, after 15 puffs, another minute basically, ready to go there. And of course, you would yank the cup quote out, throw it in there, and you're ready to go. That's basically a little over 7.5 minutes to do everything. Now I'm gonna stop this for just a second and I'll get ready to set up my hammock. Action. Okay, I'm getting the war bonnet out of the bag now. Now I've got my war bonnet and my tarp in snake skins. Just makes it easier for me to set both of them up. I've got the cinch buckle system. Some people do the whoopee swings. I like the cinch buckles because it just makes it a little bit easier. But anyway, I pre-measured these trees. These trees are about 19 feet apart. You know, you want to ideally be about between 12 and 20. So it should be good to go here. It's just a matter of boom. Now, most of you that don't know anything about hammock camping know that your ideal angle is about 30 degrees on your hammock to get you the best lie. That's the great thing about the cinch buckles, it makes it really easy. And with these, pull the snake skins back. Okay. Now the Blackbird has a foot box and it also has a storage shelf, and that's what these are for. I don't always use these, especially in the winter time, but I'm going to go ahead and set them up because that's part of the possible setup on these things. This is the shelf. That's adjustable. I gotta be honest with you, it's been a while since I've set this thing up because I've reverted to tent camping so much. That's the basic setup. Now, of course, you can tell it's low, and the reason it's low is because these trees are so short. I would normally have it about, 8 to 9 feet off the ground. But anyway, that's the hammock. Now with my tarp, I've got the tarp in snake skins also. These are DIY snake skins. But I've got a Dutch fly system on these that you probably have gear from Dutch Gear. These are the stingers, and all you do is run these around your tree and come back to the stinger itself. You just basically take it, loop it there, loop it once around there. Sorry. And then you tie it off there. And it basically just holds itself down. Now go do this other. So, make that tighter. And a key for your tarp, of course. Pause it for a second. Hold this in your hand.
Oh crap! Oh, wait, start again. Start again.
Well, don't worry, I'm going to pause it again anyway. Why? What are you?
Now I'm filming.
Stop. stop it for a second. This system, all I do is just wrap and I've got zinget line, just wrap the zinget line around. It's going to be over the over the hammock, but anyway, I've got a little Dutch clip here, fits on this continuous loop here at the end of the hammock, which is just installed with a little lark's head there. You connect those two and then come back over here. You can pull your slack out with your stinger. Again, snake skin. Now, on a day like today when it's really nice, I'm not going to worry about. Let me give you a close-up, guys, how I do mine. Lots of different ways to attach. I just like using a marlin spike hitch. It makes it so much simpler. Marlin spike hitch right there on the tarp. Right there on my stake. Good to go there. Same thing here. Marlin spike hitch. That's an infinitely adjustable knot. And it also easy to take out. Now the reason I didn't include the stakes in the weight of the two systems is because I use 6 stakes for both. For the tent, you use 6 stakes. For the hammock, you use 6 stakes. So no point weighing that because I'm using the same. Okay, that's basically the tarp. It's a matter of getting the quilt bed. Again, we're using the same quilt for the hammock and tent setup. Just throw the top quilt in. And since I've got a full length under quilt, won't need anything for the foot box. So now, again, it was recent purchase. Let me show you a couple of things about this little war bonnet Wookie. Brendan says the key is at the head is his label, but also you just fit the top of it where he's got this little continuous loop. You just fit it right over the top of your hammock. So I come here and I find the top portion of the hammock and I just fit it right over where he's got it webbed in there. And I go down with it. And on this end, if my lovely assistant will come here, I'll show you. All you do is take your little carabiner and just hook it right to the end of your hammock. So now, the only other connection point, I'll show you that on the other side over here, is where he recommends that you take the tie on the hammock and the tie on the quilt and just loop those together. So you got a little bit of a connection point there also. And he says don't worry about the fact that it's drooping a little bit because once you lie in it, all the fabric just kind of bunches around you so you don't, it takes away all the hot spots. So that's it. So that's the difference in setup time between the hammock and the tent. Surprisingly, it was like 9.5 9 minutes 32 seconds. And that was including 2 little gaps that I had in trying to get the tarp on. So, the install time is about a minute, minute and a half longer on the hammock. But as I told you earlier, in my opinion, it's worth it because the hammock is just so much more comfortable. So, hope that gives you a good idea of the difference between the two systems. You can see that the hammock takes a little longer to set up, but as I've said throughout the video, it does tend to be a little more comfortable for me. Ease of setup is a biggie for me as well. Weight is kind of a little bit of a factor, but as I said, this one's a little bit lighter than the tent. The biggie that's in favor of the tent system, of course, is the expense. The tent's about $250 less than going with the hammock system. So for a lot of you that are just getting into backpacking, that might be a significant factor to consider. You can buy cheaper tents, of course, cheaper bags, cheaper pads, as you can buy cheaper tarps and hammocks. And now there's just a dearth of hammocks out there. They're in the $75 to $100 range. You can buy some sil nylon tarps for around $100. It's really tough to save a lot of money on your quilts because the better quality quilts that are going to be, from the form to weight and warmth factor are just going to be a little more expensive. You can expect to pay between $200 and $275 for your quilt. But hope that gives you a good idea. My personal preference, of course, is hammocking. Now that I'm through with my JMT and I'm back to the mountains of North Carolina in the eastern U.S., I'll probably revert almost exclusively back to hammocks. But I've got 2 options here. I've got nephews that I love to take backpacking, and I'll take our tent sometimes, and I've got a couple other options for them as well. And I hope that you can make an informed decision based upon the information you've seen today. And if you ever have any questions about the difference between a hammock and a tent system, I hope that this video has answered a few of those questions for you. Thanks, Bodge in the Woods. Appreciate you watching. God bless. in favor of the tent system, of course, is the expense. The tent's about $250 less than going with the hammock system. So for a lot of you that are just getting into backpacking, that might be a significant factor to consider. You can buy cheaper tents, of course, cheaper bags, cheaper pads, as you can buy cheaper tarps and hammocks. And now there's just a dearth of hammocks out there. They're in the $75 to $100 range. You can buy some seal nylon tarps for around $100. It's really tough to save a lot of money on your quilts because the better quality quilts that are going to be, from a form to weight and warmth factor are just going to be a little more expensive. You can expect to pay between $200 and $275 for your quilts. But hope that gives you a good idea. My personal preference, of course, is hammocking. Now that I'm through with my JMT and I'm back to the mountains of North Carolina in the eastern U.S., I'll probably revert almost exclusively back to hammocks. But I've got two options here. I've got nephews that I love to take backpacking, and I'll take our tent sometimes, and I've got a couple other options for them as well. And I hope that you can make an informed decision based upon the information you've seen today. And if you ever have any questions about the difference between a hammock and a tent system, I hope that this video has answered a few of those questions for you. Thanks, Bodge in the Woods. Appreciate your watching. God bless.